Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, purveyor of eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings, and I am about to get into my second post on the previews for 2020. And a very fruitful group of albums that I got a hold of this year, starting the year out. Really kind of combed through a lot of best of lists to come up with some stuff, and got some really good stuff for the holidays. And I'm just going to go through these albums and give you a quick overviews of them. Many of them are albums that I've just kind of listened to once or twice, so these are very superficial first impression reviews that I will expound on later on as we kind of let them simmer and find their place in the new year. So the first one of this new set is The Rentals, The Return of the Rentals. I had a copy of this album way back when, in 1996, when it was very first released, and kind of went by, disappeared from my collection for a variety of reasons. And at the time, I was not really super into the album. It seemed a little bit, slapdash, to be honest. But in retrospect, it's actually a very forward-thinking album. Matt Sharp was a very important voice in Weezer. Although he was not credited as a very strong songwriter, I still feel like he contributed a lot to what was going on with the group, especially as they got into Pinkerton. Return of the Rentals has this kind of slackery feel to it. Vocals are sung kind of out of tune to the point where it almost feels like they kind of should be out of tune. Like double track vocals are clearly like not lining up. That was one of the things that was going on with Pinkerton. It had this sort of like deranged sense to it because of those kinds of affectations. And the Rentals album, this first one, has quite a bit of that. One of the things that the Rentals really had going on with it that was very innovative at the time was they were trying to incorporate vintage synthesizers. And in 1996, that was unheard of. You know, at the time that they did it, there was no support for it. They were always, I remember reading interviews, they were complaining that these keyboards are always breaking down, all this stuff. But it ended up being very distinctive for them to use. And many people followed that template. One that I kind of never really thought of until I went back and listened to it was one of my favorite bands, Bob Goblin. Clearly, there's a straight line between what the Rentals were doing and what Bob Goblin did with that same kind of like punk rock songwriting approach with kind of vintage keyboard sounds on it. It's very, very cool. So I'm sort of still under the impression that there's more in common between the Rentals album and Pinkerton than there was between the Green album and Pinkerton. And we'll see if I continue to think that. I may look into that theory a little bit further. Speaking of Green, next album I have is You Can't Do That on Stage, Volume 3, Frank Zappa's third installment in this series. I've already done 2 of them from last year, and I'm very excited about getting into this one. This particular 2 CD set covers a later period in the band than the previous one. You know, Volume 2, as we said, ended up being a top 10 album last year, top 5 album actually, focused on just one lineup of the band. This one focuses on one disc, especially focuses on like the 81 through 84 group. There were some slight differences between those 2 or 3 year period, but generally speaking, it was the same core group. And there's some pretty significant differences that show up after I've really kind of delved into what Frank Zappa was doing with that mid-70s group. The satire on this album is much more pronounced, but it's not like verbal satire. It's more musical satire. The baseline feel for a lot of Frank Zappa's music post-1980 is what I kind of have come to call satiric reggae. It's not a particularly great reggae feel, but he's kind of going for this reggae thing. Like, let's play it reggae style. You could hear him saying that. And a lot of the songs that he plays on here, they either redo them in a reggae style, or they're like classic Mother songs that he will do in a kind of very joking 80s synth rock style, you know, a la like Devo or something.
There's a reason you have not seen her. She is underneath the law. I know she's underneath the law, law, law.
satire spreads beyond just his lyrics, but also into a constant poke at modern music. And it's very, very pronounced with this 84 group. Great entry into the series. It's going to take, like all these Frank Zappa albums, some time to kind of sit with it and simmer with it and parse out all the details and see what's really lying underneath all that stuff. There's just a lot going on. It's, over 2 hours worth of music, and it's pretty dense. So a lot of stuff happening, and I'm going to be peeling the layers back on that one over the next few months. Next one up is Rise of Skywalker soundtrack by John Williams. I am a long-time fan of the John Williams music for Star Wars. I think that, I talk a lot about Rush being an influence on me, and I talk about actually Hall & Oates being an influence on me. But one of the most early influences in my musical upbringing was listening to John Williams' Star Wars score in my mom and dad's orange shag carpet with a record open, watching the pictures on the inside and remembering the story. Back then, whenever you saw Star Wars, you'd have to go to the theater to see it, and you never thought you may never see it again. That was unheard of. Of course, now you can pop it up on your TV and watch it whenever you want to. But back then, it was like the only way you could recreate that experience was to sit down with that album and listen to it. So I've followed John Williams' music through all of these iterations of the Star Wars movies. And even though some of the Star Wars movies are a little bit spotty here and there, the soundtracks are always phenomenal. And I feel like Rise of Skywalker is another addition to that. I think that in some ways, the Last Jedi soundtrack had some stuff going on with it that was interesting. I think it was his most complex soundtrack, and that's both to its benefit and to its detriment. This one, in a way, relies less on earlier Star Wars themes than The Last Jedi did. It's a little more freestanding. The thematic material that's new is not quite as compelling. It doesn't stick out as much, but I'm still just now kind of getting my ears around it. And especially, I've only seen the movie once, so I'm getting all that stuff kind of matched up with what theme goes with what action and what character and what feeling will take some time to figure out. But I really enjoyed listening to it. I think it's a more moody and atmospheric experience than many of the other Star Wars films, and I think that actually fits the film. It's one of those things where John Williams, like many other composers, Hans Zimmer's is another one, can really capture the essence of a film with a score. Sometimes that's great, and sometimes it's not so great. If the film is uninspired, a good composer may have an uninspired score to go along with it. So that's something to consider as we go forward with Rise of Skywalker, especially depending on how you feel about the movie. But I'm enjoying the soundtrack right now. I'll be continuing with that. Next up is Iron Maiden, Somewhere in Time. Last year, I got into Iron Maiden for the very first time. There's two songs that I really kind of know by Iron Maiden. One of them is the song that's kind of the lead single on this one, Wasted Years. And it was the one that kind of inspired me to start thinking about getting into Iron Maiden in the first place. So when I got Power Slave, I was a little disappointed to find out that song wasn't on there, and I did some research, so I ended up with this one. And that song by itself, Wasted Years, is completely worth the price of admission. Even if every other song on the album is a dud, this is such a great, great heavy metal song with an awesome melody, great harmony to it, cool message, great playing, just round and round, an incredible piece of 80s metal work. But it's not alone on the album. There's many other songs on the album that are quite good. There's also some that are a little bit more spotty. It's less consistent than Power Slave is. There's a couple songs in there that are kind of painfully repetitive. Heaven Can Wait has this lick in it that just is repeated 4 or 5 times in a row, and it kind of gets pushed into the ground a little bit. But still, if nothing else, if you treat Somewhere in Time like a single for wasted years, you'll get your money's worth out of it. Okay, next up is Saariselka's The Ground Our Sky. I got this album off of a Bandcamp recommendation. It has not failed to please me. It's a very atmospheric affair. David Gilmour's led Pink Floyd always started off their albums with these kind of like atmospheric pieces. And imagine those pieces being expanded into 7-minute pieces, 7-minute works, but with a little bit more uplift to it, less dismal. And that's kind of what this album, the Saariselka album, is getting at. It feels very light and very uplifting in its own way, but it's very, very moody and very atmospheric and very patient. It's an album that takes its time doing what it needs to do. It feels kind of like a Pink Floydian blanket that you can wrap yourself up in while you take a nap at the Great Northern Hotel, Twin Peaks. Because it definitely has some feel that evokes Twin Peaks music as well to a degree. And I've actually, of all the albums I've gotten this year, this is the one that I've listened to repeatedly the most because it works in the car and it works very well at home in the evenings as far as just having some music going on in the background that is not too obtrusive, but still very intellectually stimulating and engaging to listen to on that level. Finally, last one is Stevie Ray Vaughan's In Step. I'm raised in Austin. I came up, yes, they make people like me. I actually was, as a kid, grew up in Austin in the 70s. And so in the 80s, whenever Stevie Ray Vaughan was kind of hitting his stride and became a very big figure, of course, I was there for that. I saw Stevie Ray Vaughan open up for all people for the Moody Blues whenever I was like in, 7th or 8th grade. An incredible show. And Stevie Ray Vaughan came to mean a lot to the Austin landscape at the time. And he was very ubiquitous at the time. He was everywhere. And so if you were an Austin person, in the 80s especially, you were a fan of UT and you listened to Stevie Ray Vaughan. And that's justifiable. Stevie Ray Vaughan, especially during that time, was probably the last really great blues voice that we had. I mean, we haven't really had a really pronounced blues player come out of the woodwork and speak the way that Stevie Ray Vaughan did at the time. But Stevie Ray Vaughan was not without his troubles during that time. He was plagued a little bit by addiction, and In Step is quite famously the album that he had sobered up for. It was, I think, the late 80s, 88, I think is when the album was released. And he had kind of hit rock bottom and sobered up and got his act together and made this In Step album. And I think the difference is kind of noticeable, both in a positive and kind of in a negative way. The spontaneous fly by the seat of your pants feel that albums like Texas Flood had is not quite as pronounced on this one. He's much more kind of reserved in his playing. He's still playing great, don't get me wrong, it's still electrifying, but it's not like, it doesn't feel almost rambunctious in its feel. But on the other hand, you see Stevie Ray Vaughan stepping out of strict blues and actually kind of trying to get into some more sophisticated songwriting that incorporates the blues. And that was a different step out for him. In Step ended up being a very hopeful album for Stevie Ray Vaughan, and it showed a future ahead of him that maybe had him steering in a different direction in the long run. And so it was particularly tragic that his life was taken by that helicopter crash right whenever it seemed like he was trying to really turn himself around and take his artistry into a new direction. So In Step is a little bit of a tragic album in a way, but in another way, it's a very hopeful album. It shows Stevie Ray Vaughan playing very, very well and being very creative and taking himself seriously in a new light. The only thing I have about the album, and it's kind of a shame really, that current Austin culture has turned Stevie Ray Vaughan into kind of a cliche. I mean, right whenever I was about to leave Austin, they were selling apartment floor plans based on historic Austin musicians. So you could have gone to this one apartment complex and gotten the Stevie Ray Vaughan, or the Joe Ely, and it's just ridiculous. It's very hard to have grown up with that and having been a part of that culture, and then see him sort of, especially posthumously, treated with kind of such a superficial, capitalistic way. It's tragic, and it's hard to listen to Instep now in a way and not feel like he's been turned into a cliche, even though what he's doing here in context of late 1980s was extremely innovative and extremely relevant. Now feels a little bit like, oh, here's that Austin blues thing again, and that's a little bit unfortunate. Hopefully I'll be able to push through that and find new layers of listening to Stevie Ray Vaughan on this album, because there is some amazing stuff happening on there that I'm very excited about checking out. Okay, that's what I got for you guys for this week for my second post. I have another one coming up next week. Subscribe, like, follow me over on Spotify too. I'm adding songs from these albums to a playlist over there. So by the end of the year, we'll have a full kind of like almost radio stations worth of playlist for you to put shuffle on and check out. So check it out over there, and then get back to me if you have stuff on there. You have opinions about things, please let me know. I would really like to hear your opinions on how to use the Spotify account and what you think of the music that's kind of coming out this year. And I'll have another post for you next week. Until then, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.